The out-of-tune piano groaned under Clara's trembling fingers, and for an eternity, the silence of the concert hall transformed into a cathedral of redemption, where each forgotten note resurrected itself as a belated miracle. 3 hours earlier, Clara Evans swept the last debris from the main stage of the Grand Theater, the bristles of the broom scraping against the marble with a sound that echoed like a lament. Her hands, hardened by years of cleaning, trembled slightly, not from fatigue, but from the silent pain that pierced her whenever she stepped into this sacred space. The smell of wax and polished wood mingled with the lingering scent of expensive perfumes that hung in the air after each performance, creating an atmosphere that made her feel simultaneously at home and utterly displaced. "Clara, wrap it up. The orchestra's rehearsal starts in 20 minutes. Snapped Rodrigo Diaz, the artistic director, without looking up from the tablet where he was reviewing scores. His voice carried that impatience disguised as professionalism that Clara knew well, the tone of someone who considers certain human beings part of the furniture. "And don't forget to clean the restrooms on the second floor. We have important sponsors tonight." "Mommy, you look like a princess," Amanda had whispered backstage, clinging to her legs with eyes shining with pride. Clara remembered bending down to kiss her daughter's forehead, promising that one day they would have a big house with a grand piano all their own. But life had other plans. The car accident that claimed Miguel, her husband, also took Clara's dreams with it. The trauma to her right hand, a result of the injuries, was just the final blow in a series of losses that left her reeling. The doctor said she would regain 80% of her mobility, but for a pianist, 20% makes all the difference between excellence and mediocrity. Clara returned to the present when she heard the first chords of the orchestra's rehearsal. The sound pierced the basement walls like a sweet stab, awakening muscle memory she had tried to bury. Her hands involuntarily clenched, her fingers moving in the air as if touching invisible keys. For a moment, she was again the woman who made entire audiences hold their breath. "Are you all right?" The gentle voice of Elena, the principal cellist, brought her back to reality. The young musician had come down to the basement for a glass of water and found Clara standing in the hallway, tears silently streaming down her face. "I'm fine, thank you," Clara replied quickly, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Just the sound of the orchestra sometimes brings back memories." Elena studied Clara's face with curiosity. There was something familiar in that expression, a melancholy she recognized in herself when she played certain pieces. "You like classical music?" "I did," Clara corrected, returning to the closet, "a long time ago." "Did you play an instrument?" The question hung in the air like a suspended note. Clara hesitated, her hands tightening around the broom handle. Piano, but that was in another life. Elena approached, something shifting in her posture. "Clara Evans! Clara Evans!" She repeated the name as if tasting an aged wine. "My God, you're the Clara Evans who played here in the 90s. I have a recording of you playing Rachmaninoff's concerto. It's one of my favorite interpretations." Clara's world seemed to stop. It had been so long since someone had recognized her for her music that she had almost forgotten that she had once been more than a janitor. "You must be mistaking me for someone else," she murmured, but her voice faltered in the lie. "No, I'm sure. Your face and the way you moved your fingers just now." Elena smiled with a mixture of astonishment and reverence. "What happened? Why did you stop playing?" Clara felt her defenses crumbling. Perhaps it was the fatigue or the loneliness she had carried for so many years, but she found herself telling everything: the accident, the loss, the need to survive, the daughter who needed support. Elena listened silently, her eyes mirroring an understanding that Clara hadn't received in decades. "Your hands, do they still work?" Elena asked gently. "Not like before. My right hand, it doesn't have the same strength, the same precision." "But you can still play." Clara looked at her hands as if seeing them for the first time. "I don't know. It's been so long since I even tried." Elena gently took her hand, examining the calloused fingers. Muscles have memory. Talent like yours doesn't just disappear. Just then, Rodrigo Diaz appeared at the top of the stairs, his voice echoing down the hallway. "Elena, where are you? We need to start the second movement." "Coming," she replied, but before leaving, she held Clara's arm. "Tomorrow's Saturday. The theater's closed until 4. If you want, there's an old piano in the third-floor storage room. No one will know if you—" "No," Clara interrupted, fear seizing her. "I can't. What if someone finds out? I need this job." Elena smiled with understanding sadness. "Sometimes the biggest risk is not taking any risk at all." And she went upstairs, leaving Clara alone with the echo of her words. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. Lying in the single bed of her small apartment, she stared at the damp-stained ceiling and listened to the city traffic. Her hands rested on her chest, and she could feel her heartbeat through her palm. Was Elena right? Was there still music in her hands? She picked up her phone and called Amanda. It was late, but she knew her daughter often studied late into the night. "Hi, Mom. Everything okay? It's kind of late for you to be awake." "I'm fine, sweetheart. I just wanted to hear your voice." "Did something happen at work?" Clara hesitated. How could she explain that the past had returned to haunt her? "Amanda, do you remember when I played the piano?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Of course I remember. I have very few memories from that time, but I remember the sound. Sometimes I still dream about you playing." "Do you miss it? The music, I mean?" "I miss seeing you happy like that. Even as a child, I could tell that when you played, it was like you were whole." Amanda's words pierced Clara like sharp arrows. What if I tried playing again? "Mom, you can always try. No matter what happens, I'll be here. You taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what needs to be done despite the fear." After hanging up, Clara stayed awake until dawn, her daughter's words echoing in her mind. By the time the sun began to rise, she had made a decision. The following Saturday, Clara arrived at the Grand Theater 2 hours before its normal opening time. She had an extra key she used for emergency cleanings, and her heart pounded like a drum as she climbed to the 3rd floor. The storage room was a graveyard of old furniture, discarded sets, and abandoned instruments. In the darkest corner, covered by a dusty tarp, she found the piano. It was an old instrument with yellowed keys and scratched wood, but when Clara lifted the lid, the mechanism seemed to greet her like an old friend. Her hands trembled as they approached the keyboard, and for a moment she hesitated. What if she couldn't? What if the music had truly died with Miguel? She pressed the middle C key. The sound was muffled, slightly out of tune, but still recognizable. Clara closed her eyes and let memory guide her fingers. The first notes of Clair de Lune emerged hesitantly, like raindrops on dry earth. Her right hand struggled, her fingers not responding with their former agility, but something was there. A spark, a muscle memory that refused to die. Tears streamed down Clara's face as she played, each note a small victory against time and pain. "My God," a voice whispered behind her. Clara turned, startled, and found Elena standing in the doorway of the storage room, her eyes wide with surprise. I shouldn't be here," Clara stammered, moving away from the piano. "Don't stop," Elena pleaded, approaching slowly. "Please don't stop." "My hands, they're not the same. You can hear the mistakes, the hesitation." "I hear soul. I hear music that comes from a place that pain can't touch." Elena sat down beside her on the bench. "You know that today is the dress rehearsal for tomorrow's concert." Clara shook her head, confused. "The soloist got sick, pneumonia. Rodrigo is desperate. Canceling the concert would be a financial disaster. We have important sponsors, press critics." Elena paused, studying Clara's face. "Do you remember Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2? "Elena, no, I can't. My hands." "Your hands have stories to tell, scars that came from love, loss, survival. That's not weakness. its strength transformed into art. Clara looked at her hands, really looked. She saw the calluses from work, the small scars from household accidents, the more prominent veins that betray the passing years. But she also saw memory. She saw resilience. She saw a lifetime of dormant music waiting to awaken. What if I fail? What if you fly? You who are joining us on this journey know how important it is to believe in our dreams even when they seem impossible. If this story is touching your heart, if you too have felt like you've lost something essential of yourselves, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. Because sometimes the stories we need to hear most are those that remind us that it's never too late to start over, never too late to rediscover who we truly are. 2 hours later, Clara was on the main stage of the Grand Theater, her hands trembling over the keys of the grand piano. The orchestra watched her with curiosity and skepticism. Some musicians whispered among themselves, clearly confused about who this middle-aged woman was who had appeared to replace their renowned soloist. Rodrigo Diaz was visibly nervous, pacing back and forth backstage. "Elena, are you sure about this? We can't afford a disaster. We have the mayor in the audience, the director of the State Symphony Orchestra." Elena paused, studying Clara's face. "Do you remember Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2? "Elena, no, I can't. My hands." "Your hands have stories to tell, scars that came from love, loss, survival. That's not weakness, it's strength transformed into art." Clara looked at her hands, really looked. She saw the calluses from work, the small scars from household accidents, the more prominent veins that betray the passing years. But she also saw memory. She saw resilience. She saw a lifetime of dormant music waiting to awaken. What if I fail? What if you fly? You who are joining us on this journey know how important it is to believe in our dreams, even when they seem impossible. If this story is touching your heart, if you too have felt like you've lost something essential of yourselves, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. Because sometimes the stories we need to hear most are those that remind us that it's never too late to start over, never too late to rediscover who we truly are. 2 hours later, Clara was on the main stage of the Grand Theater, her hands trembling over the keys of the grand piano. The orchestra watched her with curiosity and skepticism. Some musicians whispered among themselves, clearly confused about who this middle-aged woman was who had appeared to replace their renowned soloist. Rodrigo Diaz was visibly nervous, pacing back and forth backstage. "Elena, are you sure about this? We can't afford a disaster. We have the mayor in the audience, the director of the State Symphony Orchestra." "Trust me," Elena replied, but her own voice held a note of uncertainty. Clara closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The silence of the Grand Theater was deafening, heavy with expectation and doubt. She thought of Amanda, probably studying at that very moment, carrying the weight of responsibility and interrupted dreams. She thought of Miguel, how he used to sit in the front row and smile at her before each performance. She thought of all the nights she had fallen asleep dreaming of music and woken to the sound of the broom. Her hands landed on the keys, and the first chord of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 echoed through the hall. There was a moment of absolute silence, and then the orchestra joined her, the strings entering like a gentle tide that supported her melody. Clara's right hand struggled with certain passages, but instead of trying to hide the limitation, she transformed it into expression. Where there had been technical speed, there was now emotional depth. Where there had been mechanical perfection, there was now human truth. Each note carried the weight of 25 years of silence, of pain transformed into beauty, of love that had survived loss. In the second movement, the most lyrical and melancholic section of the piece, Clara felt as if she were conversing with ghosts.
Her hands danced on the keys with a delicacy that came not only from technique, but from a deep understanding of what it means to lose and find again. The orchestra responded to her interpretation, the musicians playing with an intensity that surprised even Elena. During the third movement, the most vigorous and challenging, Clara felt her physical limitations reach their limit. There were passages she simply couldn't execute at the original speed. But instead of giving up, she reimagined the music, finding alternative ways to express the same emotion. She transformed speed into intensity, technique into feeling. When the last note died in the air, the silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't expectation or doubt, it was reverence. Clara opened her eyes and saw tears on the faces of some of the orchestra musicians. Elena was openly weeping, her hands trembling on her cello bow. "My God," Rodrigo Diaz murmured from the wings, his voice choked. I didn't know." Clara rose from the bench, her legs shaky from the adrenaline rush. For a moment, she was again the woman she had been before the tragedy, but she was also someone new, someone who had traversed the darkness and emerged with a wisdom that only pain can teach. "Clara," Elena approached, still with tears in her eyes. That was extraordinary. You didn't just play that music, you lived it." "I felt like I was introducing myself to Miguel again," Clara whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Rodrigo Diaz approached, visibly shaken. The man who a few hours ago had treated her like she was part of the furniture now looked at her with a mixture of astonishment and shame. "Clara, I need to apologize. I didn't know who you were. I didn't know what I'd lost." "You didn't lose anything," Clara replied softly. "You just forgot for a while. Sometimes we need to forget to be able to remember more strongly. Would you play at tomorrow's concert, officially?" Clara looked at her hands, then at the expectant faces around her. "Yes," she replied, her voice firm for the first time in years. That night, Clara called Amanda again. "Honey, I need to tell you something." "Mom, you sound different. Your voice, there's something different."
I played the piano today, for the first time in 25 years. There was silence on the other end of the line, and then Amanda began to cry. "Mom, what was it like?" "It was like breathing for the first time after being submerged for a long time. And Amanda, I want you to know that everything we went through, all the sacrifices, they weren't in vain. They brought me back home. You're going to play again? I'm playing tomorrow, in a real concert with a full orchestra. And from now on, I'm going to remember who I am." The next day, the Grand Theater was packed. Clara waited backstage, wearing a simple dress she had bought that morning, nothing like the elaborate gowns of her youth, but one that made her feel authentic. Her hands no longer trembled. There was a calmness that came from the complete acceptance of who she was and what she had to offer. 30 seconds, the stagehand announced. Elena appeared at her side. "How are you feeling?" "Complete," Clara replied without hesitation. "For the first time in 25 years, I feel complete." When she stepped onto the stage, the spotlight enveloped her like a warm embrace. The audience was a sea of expectant faces, but Clara felt no fear. She felt at home. She adjusted the piano bench, the same piano where she had last played decades ago, and looked at the orchestra. Elena smiled and nodded subtly. The concert began, and from the first notes, Clara knew that something magical was happening. Her interpretation was different from her youth, less technically perfect perhaps, but infinitely deeper. Each musical phrase carried the weight of a life lived, of losses survived, of love that transcends tragedy. During the second movement, Clara closed her eyes and felt Miguel's presence, not as a ghost, but as a blessing. She could almost hear his voice whispering, "You did it, my love. You found your way back." When she reached the end of the third movement, Clara didn't try to force the most difficult passages. Instead, she reimagined them, transforming limitation into unique expression. The orchestra followed her, adapting to her interpretation as if it were an elaborate dance. The last note echoed through the hall, and for a moment that seemed eternal, there was absolute silence. Then, like a dam bursting, the audience erupted in applause. People stood up, tears streaming down their faces, applause echoing like thunder. Clara rose from the bench and bowed, her right hand trembling slightly, not from fear, but from an emotion so intense her body could barely contain it. When she looked up, she saw Rodrigo Diaz backstage, applauding with tears in his eyes. She saw Elena, radiant with pride and joy. And in the audience, amidst the sea of unfamiliar faces, she imagined seeing Miguel smiling at her, as in the old days. After the concert, Clara was surrounded by admirers, journalists, and other musicians. Everyone wanted to know her story, to understand how someone had disappeared for so long and returned with such force. But the person she most wanted to see was on the other end of the phone line. Amanda? Mom, I watched. I caught the online stream. Oh my God, Mom, you were shining. I felt like I was talking to you through the music. Every note I played carried my love for you, my pride in who you've become. Mom, I want to come home. I want to be near you when you start all this over again. No, sweetheart, finish your studies, but now you know that when you return, you'll find a different mother. You'll find someone who remembers who she is. 6 months later, Clara had quit her cleaning job and was giving private piano lessons. Her small apartment now housed an upright piano she had managed to buy with the money from her first performances. It wasn't a grand piano, but it had an honest, warm sound that made her feel at home. Elena visited regularly, and together they had started a social project teaching music to children from underprivileged communities. Clara discovered that her imperfect hands, marked by life, were actually perfect for teaching, because they knew both the technique and the soul of music. Professor Clara, one of her students, an 8-year-old girl named Julia, asked during a lesson, "Why did you stop playing for so long?" Clara smiled, her hands resting on the piano keys. "Because sometimes we need to get lost to truly find ourselves. Sometimes the way back home is more beautiful than ever leaving it." "And you're home now?" "Yes, dear, I'm home." That afternoon, after the last student left, Clara sat down at the piano and began to play. It wasn't Rachmaninoff or Chopin. It was a simple melody she had composed, a song that spoke of second chances, of love that survives loss, of hands that learn to create beauty even wounded. Her hands weren't perfect, they never would be again, but they were hers, marked by life, tempered by suffering, strengthened by love. And in the music they created, there was a truth that technical perfection could never achieve. When Amanda arrived for the holidays, she found a transformed home. Not just because of the piano or the certificates on the wall, but because of the woman who had created it all. Clara was different, not just happy, but whole. There was a light in her eyes that Amanda hadn't seen since childhood. "Mom, you did it. You really did it." "We did it," Clara corrected, kissing her daughter's forehead. "Everything we went through, all the sacrifices, they brought us here. It wasn't a detour. It was the path." That night, mother and daughter sat at the piano together. Clara played while Amanda sang, their voices harmonizing like two instruments that had found perfect pitch. And there, in that small apartment, with a slightly out-of-tune piano, and two women who had learned to transform pain into music, happened the kind of magic that only real life can create. Clara looked at her hands on the keys and smiled. They had come home. Not to the place where they had started, but to the place where they belonged. And in the music they created together, there was a promise that they would never get lost again, because they had finally learned that the way back to themselves had always been there, waiting patiently at their fingertips. The final chord echoed through the room, and this time, Clara wasn't afraid of the silence that followed, because she knew it wasn't an ending. It was a pause, full of infinite possibilities before the next song began.